Hi there, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, and we welcome you to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break on a Wednesday, along with Edgar Zazueta. I'm Alikhan. We got a full show for you today, and as always, it is a live and interactive show, so we welcome your questions and your comments. Say hello from wherever you're watching us at. Edgar, good to see you. How are you?
Wouldn't be good, Naj. Wouldn't be a Wednesday without being here with you and our friends. So excited to be back here today.
And this is Edgar and I have already spent a couple of hours with each other today. As usual, it's been in this type of platform. And we have not at any moment been able to talk about what's happened over at the state capitol. So be ready, folks, because we've got plenty to talk about with that. And of course, as we said, your questions and comments, we're live and interactive, so go ahead and tell us where you're watching from and say hello. Edgar, I got a full thing of notes over here, so let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to start with the governor's blueprint for a safer economy, the color-coded tier system that's come out. 4 tiers, purple, red, orange, yellow. It looks like that Department of Homeland Security thing when you get to the airport. The governor calls this process, quote, simple, and it adds some clarity, but at least advancing through the tiers, it's going to take longer. He says there will be that 21-day mandatory waiting period before a county can be considered. All right, Edgar, let's break this down. How is this going to impact school districts?
Yeah, well, we joke that if we have a job here at ACSA over the last 6 months, is we've become a pseudo translator, right, to the things that come out from the governor and from the administration. So this is just the last iteration of guidance, and this applies to industries besides schools, but it definitely has an impact on schools. And I think this was the announcement that the governor made last Friday. So as Naj, you said, we've abandoned the old list. Before we were talking about the county monitoring list. And just to do a little bit of a reset, in July, mid-July, the governor put out new rules for who was eligible to reopen for in-person instruction. And at the time, it was essentially only schools that were not on the county monitoring list were eligible for in-person instruction. And at some point, we had upwards of 40 some odd counties on that list. The vast majority, I think 80-90% of our student population or our state population were in one of those counties that was not allowed to open for in-person instruction. And this is really at the heart of this last wave of COVID infections. So given that the health situation has somewhat stabilized in some counties, there was a big push across the state about what are going to be the rules for reopening everything, not just schools, business, everything. And hence where I think there was a big push, there was some sentiment that the first time we did reopening that maybe we were too aggressive or the state was too aggressive. Hence, some of the COVID infection rates went up. So the governor put out this new blueprint that's intended, to your point, to try to simplify it. And we'll let our viewers be the judge of whether it's simple or not. But it is 4 categories. And namely, I think the 2 most important pieces is that before there was a number of criteria that really dictated whether you were on these monitoring lists. The monitoring list is replaced with this purple category. The widespread, which they deem as widespread, that there's widespread still infection rates in a particular county. And the 2 indicators that are prevalent there is that there's that you have positivity rates. So when they test for COVID, that you have positivity rate of more than 8%, and that you have more than 7 cases per 100,000 individuals. I know that gets really confusing with the numbers and whatnot, but really those are the 2 big things that dictate whether you're in this purple area. And now let me sum it all up as it relates to schools. If you're in the purple, you have to do distance learning. Only schools outside of the purple are eligible for in-person instruction. I haven't counted because I know this list fluctuated. I think we're upwards of 30 some odd counties, mid-30s, if I'm not mistaken, are now still in this purple category. But there is some notable counties that are starting to come off.
Yeah, that was something that I thought was interesting, with some of the notable counties that were coming off. We want to say hello to our valued viewers. Many of you repeat customers here on the lunch break: David, Denise, Justine, Holly, Antoinette, Tracy, Scott Muhammad. Hey, thanks so much for being back with us. Hey, Edgar, I'm going to ask you about pushback from the county level as far as the color codes and all of that. But first, we do have a question that's coming from John Huber, New View Union School District. He asks, any updates on the CRF? Has the deadline on these funds been extended by chance, or is it still December 31st? Are you hearing anything related to that?
So CRF, and I'm not always great with my acronyms, but I think he's talking about the Corona relief funds and on the federal front. And will be a topic when we get our guest Laura on in a few. We could talk about some of the efforts. So right now there's a bit of a stalemate in terms of what's happening in DC, and this is in the cards. So there is proposal, I believe it's in the Senate, in Congress, that they put forward that we would get an extension of how long we had to spend those funds. But to date, there's kind of a stalemate, and we'll get into that here at the bottom of our show in terms of what's happening in DC.
Let me ask again about that pushback at the county level, because we do have, some advocacy going on, a little bit of pushback on the county level, because, we're glad that there's a little more clarity now with this color-coded system, but that doesn't mean that everything is so cut and dry. What are you hearing from some of the counties?
Yeah, so I think what's notable now is that we have some counties that are a little more populous in terms of the state coming off. Notably, San Diego and Orange County, I think, has met the criteria. I don't know if they're officially off or not, but San Diego, if you look at the COVID-19 website, they are eligible now. So they're out of this purple category in the red category. Red usually is bad, but red actually in this case is that you now are eligible to open a number of industries, schools being one of them. Little confusing because they did move the deadlines. You essentially have to be off of that. You have to meet the criteria for 14 days. And then you have to be in this next tier for an additional 14 days. So it essentially doubled the time that would take for us to even be eligible to open schools. But San Diego is in that category and will be at the end of this month, I believe, eligible to now open up for in-person instruction. And what's been in the news here, I think this morning, over the last couple of days, is that now even counties that are at least talking about the idea of going back to in-person instruction, there is some pushback from some of our labor partners, from some of our teachers, from some of our groups. And I would say pushback maybe is not the right word. There's at least some expressed concern about the state indicator now says that we may be eligible for in-person instruction, but there's still some questions about whether it's quote unquote safe to go back to in-person instruction. So I think this is just the beginning of it. I think this is going to be a conversation we're going to that is going to be happening in basically every county that is now comes off of that list and can at least even consider going to in-person instruction.
Yeah, and our valued member Phil Drum from Tulare City School District thanks us for these. Hold on, I want to make sure that I quote this correctly, for these lunch sessions. So Phil, now it's your responsibility to tell us what exactly you are eating during this lunch break, because we empower you to make sure you're eating while you're joining us here. Hey, Edgar, we've got a lot of topics, but I do want to bring in our guest today, so we have the opportunity to just kind of go broadly on some of these topics. Laura Preston is ACSA's legislative advocate, one of them, and she was dying to come on to the show after Derek Lennox was on the show from the ACSA Governmental Relations Department last week. So we bring in Laura onto the show. Laura, good to see you. How are you?
Hi, good, thank you.
She begged us to come on, right?
There's a joke here for everybody. I hate being on camera, so they're always having to twist my arm.
Yeah, let's be serious, Laura. You were dying to be on the show. Derek got all kinds of play last week. Hey, I want to ask you and Edgar as well about legal liability right now, because there was an article in EdSource yesterday. Our good friend John Fensterwald wrote this article talking about legal protections with COVID-19 lawsuits, that some schools may be hesitant to actually physically reopen and remain in distance learning until those protections are real. And Wes Smith, ACSA Executive Director, was quoted in there. He said, quote, absolutely, without question, districts around the state will be hesitant if there aren't liability protections for when they follow health and safety guidelines in good faith. I'm going to have both of you guys comment on this because I think it's important. What type of legislation were school districts really looking for, and why were we not able to get those types of liability protections during this last legislative session? So jump in, Edgar, Laura, by all means.
Edgar, do you want to start?
Go ahead.
So the issue of liability is one that, as many of you know, the legislature has a lot of different pressure points and advocates on all sides. And it's somewhat appalling, if you ask me, that the trial lawyers and consumer attorneys were stating that without having the fear of liability, this is Laura's words, not theirs exactly, but to paraphrase, that without having the threat of being sued, that we would not be doing what we need to do to keep our schools, our employees, and our students safe, which could not be further from the truth. The bill never got a hearing, which is telling, but we've had some conversations that are somewhat optimistic. We're not going to let the time pass. We're going to continue to keep pushing the legislature during their break about the issue of liability in the hopes that we can revisit it again in January when they return. It's going to need a legislative fix. The governor can't just say we're not going to, have any liability. It has to be a legislative fix. So, I mean, this fall will tell us a lot of things. It's also troubling because not only do we have liability, the legislature on the last night of session passed a workers' compensation bill that is it covers COVID now beyond what workers' comp did in the past. And so it kind of divides it into two sets of employees. You have your fire, police, healthcare workers that receive one whole standard of workers' comp, which is it would be presumed automatically that they got COVID from their place of work just due to their job. For education, we're in the second round, if you will, which does expose us to workers' comp. We have an ability within a very short time frame to rebut whether that person, the employee, got COVID at the school districts, but it's really tight. And there's also a piece in there that if you have 5 to 100 employees, and it's at your school site, I mean, at the site of employment, if you have 5 employees, it's considered a cluster, and therefore the school district is going to be liable for your COVID workers' comp. So that's adding a whole nother level of exposure. So we were fighting hard at the end of session saying that, if you want us to reopen schools, you can't have it. You can't have us have all these obstacles in our way. No liability protection, now greater exposure of workers' comp. And we can talk about special ed too, if we'd like to, a little bit later on. But those are all real things that we are going to, once the dust is settled, that session just ended Monday night, that we're going to start talking about how do we package this message to legislators and really using all of your voices to help us get that word out to the governor, the legislature, that this is what you just did to us, not piecemeal, but put it all together in a package so they see all the things that are going to be in the way of school districts reopening.
Thanks, Laura. And before I ask a similar question, I just have to brag about Laura for a second. I mean, she takes on, just like the example right now, she takes on all the issues that, frankly, as ACSA, we like to joke around. The issues that she jokes nobody else wants to deal with. But it's just, there's no person, I would argue, at ACSA that is more loyal to just the perspectives of the issues impacting our members than Laura Preston. And, she really takes this work, like all of us, personal in terms of when the state is really impeding in our members' efforts to do the work. So just thank you for that, Laura, because we know how much you put into this. I wanted to put something out that we could both comment on. Barbara Nemko, one of our county superintendents, brings up that there's a lot of questions about sufficient testing and substitutes. And what makes me think about that, and also the issues you talked about, is that there's this commensurate number of issues now that are all impacting our ability to reopen, right? Whether it be liability, whether it be now workers' comp, and now questions about testing. And I think that's been one of the themes in terms of this year of where do our schools go to, right? Where that there's a number of things that are becoming challenging. But then on this issue of testing and sufficient stubs, and I know you deal closely with our HR counsel, so you could probably comment on that. But yes, to Barbara's point, this testing issue, we're already hearing, going back to this dashboard that we talked about, in counties that are off of that purple, but are now eligible to reopen. I know some of our labor partners, other groups have been talking about, okay, yes, the numbers may dictate that we're off, but do we have the sufficient testing? Do we have the contact tracing? Do you want to touch on the substitute issue? Because I know that's something that others have brought up as well.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying anything that no one on, anyone on this call doesn't know, but it's an issue, the lack of subs. And many districts are experiencing teachers and administrators just deciding they're leaving the profession now, that this is like the breaking point for them, which also begs the question if we need more subs. So we are looking into a variety of ways. I don't have anything conclusive to tell you. We're looking at, is it possible for STRS to waive the earnings limitation for this COVID amount of time? I don't think that's possible, but we're going to try as a one door to open so that we can recruit more people to come back for a period of time. But it's the human resource part of this, and our HR counsel is very, very involved in discussing these issues about how we should position ourselves and move forward a message. But the issue of substitutes is going to continue to be a problem, not only because we don't have the bodies, but people aren't going to want to be subs in classrooms either. So it's a real challenge, and it's going to butt up against some of the rules, if you will, that have been put into the statute that limit our ability to have people in the classroom. We can't have lots of people. We have to be very strict in compliance with what the law says, which just exacerbates our problem as well. I don't think I gave you a very good answer, but that's it's on our radar though.
Well, you know what? We're going to mention Barbara Nemko once again, because Barbara asks specifically, and I'll have both of you chime in on this one, about suggestions for who and how we move forward related to this liability. And obviously there is an advocacy piece to this, but how do educators move forward? How do they connect with lawmakers? Laura, we'll ask you this first. Because obviously there is a very big need for that connectivity to happen, because maybe school districts are going to be forced to wait for these protections to come in place before they physically open.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I think that's very accurate, Naj. We are working, my colleague Derek has been doing a phenomenal job on working on how our messaging moving forward. We were really fortunate. Many of you really did the work and helped us. We had 41, I believe, legislators sign on to a letter urging for a hearing on the liability issues. So we have support amongst a lot of legislators. So we're going to need to take those folks, some of them are termed out, but take those and really revisit with them and try to really hit home while legislators are at home, if you will, during this next break. This is the time where you have access to them, where you can demand that they have to respond to us. And it comes back, and we're going to figure out the right messaging for you, because it's sort of like, we don't want to get in the weeds about workers' comp. Nobody wants to talk about that. It makes your eyes roll back, and it's too complicated. But if you tie it to the liability issue as one more pressure point to keep us an exposure for districts to be able to reopen, then I think we're creating that swell of, aha, is what we really want from legislators. Like, you guys just did this to us, and you don't even, they did. The legislature deals with issues that are in front of them at that time. They don't think of it in totality, and all of you get to live with what they've done in totality and have to implement it. So I think it's going to be incumbent upon us to figure out that right message to get to you, so that we can really hit them hard during the break, because they can't get away with not helping us. They can't talk out of both sides of their mouth, frankly, say we want schools to reopen and then prevent you from being able to reopen.
The only thing I would add, I think Laura hit it out of the park with that answer in terms of how we move forward. I think this is a lesson, not just on this liability. I think, this is one piece of the bigger picture. I think and we sometimes sound like a broken record here, but I think it's for a reason. If there was ever a time to be telling our story about what the realities are for kids, for students in the classroom, and always bringing it back. So whether we're talking about an operational issue like liability, like HR issues, how is this impacting students? How is this impacting kids, right? And I think that this is, again, it's a cumulative effect. I think one of the things that's a little alarming, there's some reporting this week from LA Times and others about the number of our youngest kids, our kindergarten enrollments in a lot of our districts is down. And I think that this is, while we all are keeping the health and safety of students at the forefront, and that's why we're doing distance learning, at some point we're going to have to figure out a way to transition back, because as we're already seeing, either parents are choosing to find other options, but the scarier piece of this is that for families that don't have the means, they don't have the capacity to really help their kids have a full-time job, or may not have the luxury of being at home.
Right.
That some of those kids are falling off the radar, right? So I think it's almost a reality check that we're all just trying to make the best of the situation. But with all of these cumulative issues, we're going to have to figure out a way how to get our schools up and running at some point in the future.
And also about the safety of our students. There are some of our students, and you all know this better than we can even articulate it, that are at risk by being secluded away from schools for a variety of reasons. And we're starting to see some of those pop up in our Zoom classrooms. And so that's another issue for us as well that we're very conscious of and want to make sure our students are protected.
And we just had an interesting comment come in from Rob Mangawala. And Rob, I probably mispronounced your name, so my apologies. Remember, my name is Naj, and it's mispronounced all the time. But Edgar, I'll have you respond first to this, because we had Austin Butner, the superintendent from LA Unified, on this show a few weeks ago, talking about that initiative to begin testing students, staff, teachers in LA Unified. And he brings up Napa is in the red, able to open. Guidelines suggest that we should test 25% of employees to the greatest extent possible. We feel that this is a county health issue and not a district issue. Edgar, I'm going to have you respond first, and then Laura, if you have any additional comments. There seems to be this back and forth right now, almost this, we're punting the football. Should this be a county issue? Should this be a school district issue? Should this be a state issue as far as testing and setting regulations? Edgar, you were here for that interview with Austin. School district is taking that on, but it is not the same environment in every county that we go to.
Yeah, I think Rob, I couldn't agree more with Rob that in many ways there's this theme, and even if we'll talk about just some of the general themes from this legislative session, there's this tendency to push all of this down to the schools, right? Where our folks really need to be thinking about, how do we educate our students? In this case, in most of our schools, is how do we do the best we can with distance learning? How do we come up with our plans to do, whether it be hybrids or at some point back to full in-person instruction? That we're not health officers. Our folks aren't health officers. They're educators, right? And unfortunately, so much of the policy, we're reflecting on what are the big issues here in this legislative session. Well, so often we're talking, and just hence look at, we're 20 minutes in the conversation, we're talking about more about some of the things that happen outside of the legislature, frankly, than the things happening under the dome. And that's because so much of this has been driven by county public health. And not, while they are obviously looking at this from the county health, from the public health perspective, those things aren't always grounded in the realities of schools, as we've said many times. And I think the testing issue, if I had to guess, this is going to be a huge topic of discussion. If I look to this fall or even into early 2021, what is it that we're going to do as we're expanding testing? I would not be surprised if we see more on that front about what are we doing on targeted testing. Obviously, LA Unified is being a trendsetter here in what they're doing in California. You look what's happening on the other side of our country right now with some tensions in their reopening. It's centered on this issue as well, and in New York, about what they're going to do in terms of testing and what is the role in our case, whether it be the county or the state, to really push that forward?
We're gonna move over to some federal issues, but I think, Laura, let me just ask you as we move over to that subject matter, because I think it's important. I just lost the, hold on for just a moment. We've got so many great comments, folks. Keep sending your questions and your comments in. Denise Patton asks this question, and Edgar, you mentioned the telling the stories piece of it, school districts telling their story. Laura, your thoughts, because Denise says there are so many schools that want to reopen. Is it time that our parents start assisting with liability advocacy? Maybe we need to add their voices. Laura, when you hear a question or suggestion like that, how important do you think the position is right now for parents to start getting involved in that conversation?
Oh, I think it's very, very important. And that, I mean, it's a fantastic suggestion. Denise, I saw it when Edgar was speaking, I thought, oh gosh, that's, phenomenal, but it's going to have to be driven, I think, at the local level. When we further develop our talking points for you, to maybe have you also recruiting, your parents. I don't know that we have talked to PTA about some of this. They have not been willing to get involved yet. The unions are we had CTA neutralized at least. So it's really, this is an issue that is on the employer, if you will, the district. And so that's why I think lending that voice, legislators are political. They want to get reelected, and having their voters, raising concerns is definitely the best way to get their attention.
Over to some federal issues, specifically nutrition, because USDA extended the summer meals waiver through the end of the calendar year, or when the money runs out, whichever comes first. What have you been hearing from school districts and school leaders, and what does this waiver extension mean to school districts and specifically students?
It's a great question. What we've been hearing is that obviously when the waiver was expired, we heard a lot because the need has not gone away. And the fact that we have students who maybe in the past were not receiving free or reduced meals, but now need them. And then the paperwork that goes along with the regular accounting of nutrition programs is rather cumbersome. So there was a real feeling, and this is where you're so proud to represent educators because they care so much about our students, that they were worried about their students being fed or not. In addition, many districts, because of a lack of some reduction in our student enrollment, and because of not as many families, it seems, in certain parts of the state are receiving nutrition, that we have employees that are there that maybe not have as much work to do either, but we need to keep them on staff. So having this flexibility for us, I think it's exactly what we wanted. It was a bipartisan effort. We were thrilled to hear it. As Naj said, it's till the end of the year or when the money runs out, whichever comes first. So we'll revisit that issue at the end of the year for next year if we need to, but I think it was a welcome relief for all of us.
Laura, while we're talking about federal advocacy, and I know you and Jason Henderson on our team are keeping an eye on things for us and what's happening in DC. So we got the question about some of the relief dollars and whether we're going to get an extension. Things have been generally quiet in Washington, DC. I mean, aside from there being a presidential campaign and, our elected leaders, really the focus, but kind of what's the latest on what's happening back there with some relief for schools in terms of the ongoing pandemic? That's
not an easy question to ask any longer. If you'd asked me that question a couple months ago, I would have said, absolutely, it's going to happen. We're going to, get another, lump sum of money, and, all will be great. It doesn't feel quite the same. And I don't want to be negative and scare everybody, say it's not going to happen. It's just that the Republicans in the Senate are so far away from the Democrats in the House, and they have to get along to make this agreement go. So we just found out that the Senate Democrats have they have the votes for a smaller CARES package relief bill, but I don't think that the House is going to go for it. The other piece too about liability that I had forgot to mention earlier, but it's timely here, is that the Senate Republicans want liability protection for all employers. Not if you've not taking care of your employees or whatever, but in essence, liability protection for including schools. So if that can get into this federal law, then that's taken care of, that way. But it's just right now, they're just so far apart. So we're hoping, I can't allow myself to think that we're not going to get the resources. So I'm going to say we are, but how much we're going to get and when we're going to get them right now is anybody's guess. They come back, soon. And then they only have like a month to do all this work before they leave for the remainder of the year. So, it's a huge thing that we're looking at. And then special ed compounding, and I kind of doing a little bit of a bird walk, but you're all going to never invite me back because I have all these great pieces of news. But there have been 2 class action lawsuits filed. I don't know if many of you are aware of it or not. One in New York against every state in the nation and almost every school district in every state, including California. And then one a couple days ago, another class action lawsuit filed in California against every school district, the governor, the superintendent of public education, public health, blah, 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 all for due process violations for SPED. And we've been waiting for this to happen. But we're now, Congress was unwilling to have these discussions earlier. We brought it up, months ago, saying this is going to be another problem for school districts and we should create a fund of some sort. And at the time there was little interest because nothing had really happened yet. It was just us, projecting that it would be happening. So now we're starting to have those conversations, and we're all the various groups that I work with are starting to contact their federal members and members of Congress, and for us to start seeing if there's something we can do. So in a way, it's a good thing these lawsuits happened because maybe now we'll finally get some traction for some changes that we've made. Of course, that's easy for me because I'm not the one getting sued. So I can say that sitting in the comfort of my house. But I think that it's exactly what we've been waiting for and knowing that it was on the horizon. And so they've both dropped one was in beginning of August and one was this week.
All right, Laura, speaking of your house, folks, for our viewers, I want to take you deep into the annals of what ACSA headquarters in Sacramento looks like. Edgar's office is decorated in LA Dodgers stuff. My office is decorated with high school football helmets representative of our school district. So you should send in more. Laura, you have quite an eclectic collection of San Francisco 49er stuff in your office. And I'm interested to know, in your home, in your workspace that you're currently at right now, have you been able to replicate that setup that you have at the office?
Well, it's not quite as robust, but I have my masks at my disposal, one in my car, one in the house. My phone case is San Francisco. You can't see my laptop, but I have a skin on it that's 49ers. My keychain is 49ers. And my purse that I'm now trying to carry smaller stuff is a 49er bag. The other day, I just realized as I was walking, I was going to the grocery store and I had my phone out with my mask on, with my purse. People are probably thinking I'm some wackadoodle out there, that covered in 49ers, but I have to represent them wherever I go. So, yeah.
And Edgar, I have to tell you, 2 years ago, I'm getting on the train to go see my Chicago Bears play the 49ers, and I don't get like 5 rows in, and there's Laura heading to a 49er game. She's that big of a fan.
She is a
but the Bears fans are better than our fans, I think, because you guys were crazy.
Bunch of crazy fans. We can't show those pictures up. Laura Preston, ACSA Legislative Advocate. Laura, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, we do want to let you know of two important events that are taking place over the next week. Let's hit the first one, which is happening, I believe, tomorrow between 4 and 5. ACSA and CALSA are teaming up for a webinar with some education leaders who are talking about early lessons learned from this school year. So our social media whiz, Gianna Miller, is going to be putting the link for registration and information on that. So go ahead and copy and paste that. Also, site administrators. We wanted to make sure that we were passing along some very deep information to all of you as well. So there's a webinar set up for next Wednesday, September 9th, 3 p.m. Supporting site administrators webinar. The very first one is going to be focused on privacy and confidentiality related to digital learning and liability. So of course, we've been talking so much about liability. Gianna is putting that information in the chat as well. So go ahead and make sure that you're copying and pasting that. Mohammed, the answer is yes, I certainly do. And Edgar, as I bring you back on here, we have now for the second consecutive week crossed that bottom of the hour, which means we are giving the members exactly what they want. End of session was Friday. You and your team have been incredibly busy, but you've talked a lot about a shortened session, not as much getting done because of COVID, because of the facilities issue. Even last week, we had that breaking news where they had to call off Senate for the day. Do you think in the next legislative session, because there will be a little bit more, I don't want to say comfortability with how things have operated during this particular session, but do you see the next session being a little bit more substantive as far as legislation is concerned, because the experience of all of this has already been there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this year there was definitely a lot out there, and there was a lot of bills and things that impacted schools. I think it was just because of the shutdown, because the legislature was out, so much of this came out of executive action and executive orders or guidance from the governor. I think that pendulum will find a little bit more balance. And I think this fall is going to be a big case study, given how distance learning goes and getting what the temperament of the policymakers are, frankly. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. I think the trailer bill language that dictated how distance learning was going to look, and the requirements we had in place, or even language about them preferring in-person instruction, was a result of some frustration that a lot of policymakers were having about their own kids. And they saw firsthand, right or wrong, that it colored their perspective. So I think what they hear from our folks, what they hear from educators, what they see with their own eyes will really dictate what kinds of legislation, what policy we see here coming in January. With that said, there's still the chance of a special session. The stuff coming out from the governor's office is nonstop. So I don't expect that this is going to be a quiet fall by any means in terms of what's happening, whether it be Sacramento or DC.
Well, that's good. That's good news, because there's a lot to get done. Edgar, you and I are getting to see each other 4 times this week. This is definitely the best one that you and I have shared. So Edgar, good to see you today.
Thanks, Naj. Always fun.
All right, folks, and thank you so much for joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Remember, we're here on Wednesdays with the latest information from the state capitol and how that news and information impacts you. Have a great rest of the week. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much.